Welcome back to the Face of America channel.
Tonight we're diving into the life of Francis Key Howard, a man whose story is woven into the fabric of American history, not just through his famous lineage, but through his own bold actions and the ironic twists of fate that defined his path. Born on October 25, 1826, in Baltimore, Maryland, Francis Key Howard was the grandson of Francis Scott Key, the revered author of The Star-Spangled Banner, and Revolutionary War hero John Eager Howard. His life, spanning a mere 46 years, until his death in 1872, was marked by a commitment to his principles, a clash with a nation in turmoil, and a poignant connection to the very fort that inspired his grandfather's anthem. Let's explore his journey step by step, through the places, people, and moments that shaped him. Francis, often called Frank, grew up in Baltimore steeped in prominence and privilege. His father, Charles Howard, was the son of Eager Howard, a Revolutionary War colonel and Maryland governor. His mother, Elizabeth Phoebe Key Howard, was the daughter of Francis Scott Key, tying Frank directly to the legacy of the national anthem. The Howard household was a hub of Southern sympathy, rooted in Maryland's complex identity as a border state during the Civil War era. Baltimore in the 1830s and 1840s was a bustling port city, its streets alive with trade, politics, and simmering tensions over slavery and secession. Frank's early years were spent in this vibrant yet divided environment, shaped by a family that was both patriotic and fiercely independent. As a young man, Frank pursued a career in journalism, a field that suited his sharp mind and strong opinions. By the 1850s, he had become the editor of the Baltimore Exchange, a newspaper known for its pro-Southern stance. This was no small role in a city like Baltimore, where political loyalties were split and words in print could sway hearts or spark outrage. Frank's editorials reflected the sentiments of many Marylanders who sympathized with the Confederacy, particularly as tensions between the North and South escalated. His writing was bold, often critical of the federal government's actions, and it would soon place him at the center of a national controversy. The year 1861 was a turning point for Frank and for the nation. The Civil War had begun, and Maryland's position as a border state made it a powder keg. On April 27, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland, a drastic measure prompted by the Baltimore riot of 1861, where pro-Southern mobs clashed with Union troops. This suspension allowed the government to arrest and detain individuals without formal charges, a policy that Frank found abhorrent. His great-uncle by marriage, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, had already declared Lincoln's actions unconstitutional in the case of ex parte marrymen in 1861, but Lincoln, citing precedent from Andrew Jackson, ignored the ruling. Frank, as editor of the Exchange, didn't hold back. He penned scathing editorials condemning Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, the imposition of martial law in Baltimore, and the arrest of local officials, including Mayor George William Brown, Congressman Henry May, and the entire city council. Frank's words were his weapon, but they came at a cost. Just after midnight on September 13, 1861, his life took a dramatic turn. As he later recounted in his book, 14 Months in American Bastilles, quote, "On the morning of the 13th of September, 1861, at my residence in the city of Baltimore, I was awakened about 12:30 or 1 o'clock by the ringing of the bell." End quote. When he opened the door, 2 men entered, informing him of an order for his arrest. Quote, "In answer to my demand that he should produce the warrant or order under which he was acting, he declined to do so, but said he had instructions from Mr. Seward, the Secretary of State, end quote, Frank wrote. With no warrant and no charges specified, he was forced into a carriage and taken to Fort McHenry, the very fort where his grandfather had penned the Star-Spangled Banner, 47 years earlier, during the War of 1812. The irony of this moment was not lost on Frank. As he stood in his cell at Fort McHenry on September 14, 1861, he gazed out at the flag wavering over the fort and reflected on the stark contrast between his situation and his grandfather's. He wrote, quote, "When I looked out in the morning, I could not help but be struck by an odd and not pleasant coincidence. On that day, 47 years before, my grandfather, Mr. Francis Scott Key, then prisoner on a British ship, had witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry. When on the following morning the hostile fleet drew off, defeated, he wrote the song so popular throughout the country, the Star-Spangled Banner. As I stood upon the very scene of that conflict, I could not but contrast my position with his, 47 years before. The flag which he had then so proudly hailed, I saw waving at the same place over the victims of as vulgar and brutal a despotism as modern times have witnessed." End quote. Fort McHenry, a star-shaped stronghold guarding Baltimore's harbor, was no longer just a symbol of American resilience. It had become a prison for political detainees like Frank. Named after James McHenry, a signer of the Constitution, the fort was now a holding ground for Confederate sympathizers, including Frank's own father, Charles Howard, who had been arrested earlier for his role as president of the Baltimore Board of Police. The Howard family's loyalty to the Southern cause was unwavering. Frank's mother, Elizabeth, was as staunch a secessionist as any, and a humorous anecdote from 1862 illustrates her defiance. During the Maryland campaign, Federal recruiters visited the Howard home, seeking men for the Union militia. Elizabeth listed her husband and 6 sons, all either imprisoned or serving in the Confederate Army. When asked about her youngest, McHenry Howard, she replied, quote, "McHenry Howard, he is also in the Southern Army and with Stonewall Jackson, and I expect he will be here soon." End quote. The flustered recruiters left a draft notice, which McHenry received unopened 3 years later, much to his amusement. Frank's imprisonment at Fort McHenry was just beginning. He was soon transferred to Fort Lafayette in New York's Lower Bay off Brooklyn, a grim hexagonal fortress known as the American Bastille. The damp, cramped cells there housed other political prisoners, including Maryland legislators and journalists. Later he was moved to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, a granite-walled island fortress, where conditions were slightly better, but still far from comfortable. For 14 months from September 1861 to November 1862, Frank endured confinement without formal charges, a testament to the sweeping powers Lincoln wielded during the war. His time in captivity was not idle. Frank's resolve only strengthened, and he later wrote, quote, "We came out of the prison as we had gone in, holding in the same just scorn and detestation the despotism under which the country was prostrate, and with a feeling that our own conduct had been such as became good citizens of a republic." End quote. During his imprisonment, Frank's thoughts often turned to his family and their shared ordeal. His father Charles was also detained, and his brothers, James, John Eager, Edward Lloyd, Charles, and McHenry, were either imprisoned or fighting for the Confederacy. The Howard family's collective defiance was a microcosm of Maryland's divided loyalties. Frank's wife, Lydia Hollingsworth Howard, whom he married around 1850, remained in Baltimore, managing the household under the strain of her husband's absence. The couple had several children, including daughters Elizabeth and Anne, and their family life was deeply affected by the war's disruptions. Frank was released on November 26, 1862, after 14 months of detention, as part of a broader release of political prisoners, following Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and a shift in Union policy. He returned to Baltimore, a city still under martial law, and resumed his work as a journalist. though the Baltimore Exchange had been suppressed during his imprisonment. Undeterred, Frank turned his experience into a powerful narrative. In 1863 he published 14 Months in American Bastilles, a detailed account of his arrest and detention. The book, printed by Kelly, Hedian, and Piet in Baltimore, was both a personal memoir and a political indictment of Lincoln's policies. In it, Frank argued that the suspension of habeas corpus was a betrayal of American liberties, writing, quote, "The government of the United States had virtually ceased to have any legal existence. It had been supplanted by a military despotism." End quote. The publication of his book was a bold move in a city occupied by Union forces, but Frank's commitment to his principles was unwavering. He continued to advocate for states' rights and Southern interests, even as the Confederacy's fortunes waned. After the war ended in 1865, Baltimore began to rebuild, and Frank remained an active figure in the city's intellectual and social circles. He worked as a merchant and a banker, contributing to the economic recovery of a region scarred by conflict. His family's prominence endured, with his brother McHenry Howard later writing his own memoir, Recollections of a Maryland Confederate Soldier and Staff Officer, published in 1914, which echoed Frank's disdain for federal overreach. Frank's later years were quieter, focused on family and business, but his health began to decline. On August 29, 1872, at the age of 46, Francis Key Howard died in Baltimore. His death was noted in local papers such as the Baltimore Sun, which described him as a respected citizen and a man of conviction. He was buried in Greenmount Cemetery, a historic Baltimore resting place where many of Maryland's elite, including his grandfather John Eager Howard, were laid to rest. Frank's grave, marked by a simple stone, lies near those of his parents, Charles and Elizabeth, a silent testimony to the family's enduring legacy. What makes Frank's story so compelling is its blend of personal conviction and historical irony. He was a man who stood firm in his beliefs, even when they led him to a cell in the shadow of his grandfather's flag. His arrest at Fort McHenry, a place of national pride, underscored the tensions of a nation divided. His book, 14 Months in American Bastilles, remains a primary source for historians studying civil liberties during the Civil War, offering a first-hand perspective on a controversial chapter in American history. As historian Frank Towers notes in The Urban South and the Coming of the Civil War, Frank's detention was part of a broader crackdown on Baltimore's pro-Southern elite, a move that secured Maryland for the Union, but at the cost of individual freedoms. Frank's life also reflects the complexity of Maryland's role in the Civil War. As a border state, Maryland was a battleground of ideas, as much as armies, and the Howard family embodied this struggle. Frank's mother Elizabeth, with her sharp wit, and his brothers with their Confederate service, were as much a part of this history as Frank himself. Their collective defiance, rooted in a deep sense of state pride, challenges us to consider the nuances of loyalty and liberty in times of crisis. As we reflect on Francis Key Howard's life, we're reminded that history is not just about grand events, but about the individuals who navigate them. Frank was no hero in the traditional sense, nor was he a villain. He was a man of his time, shaped by his family's legacy and his city's divisions, who chose to speak out when silence might have been easier. His story, from the streets of Baltimore to the cells of Fort McHenry, Fort Lafayette, and Fort Warren, is a window into a nation wrestling with itself. And in that struggle, under the shadow of the Star-Spangled Banner, Frank Howard found his voice, a voice that still echoes in the pages of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Francis Key Howard. May his story inspire you to explore the complex tapestry of America's past, where every thread, no matter how small, adds to the richness of our shared heritage.